Thank you for the kind presentation. Thank you to Professor Kai and to all the organizers of this meeting. I am very honored to have been invited here, and I will try to do my best to give you an idea about wild boar, an animal that is doing many different things in the same continent, and this will be the final message of this presentation. What I would like to do with you today is to give a broad overview of the distribution and the status of this species in Europe, and then to discuss together the management problems that derive from the present situation. As you know, wild boar has a very wide distribution. Looking at this distribution in detail for Europe, you may notice that nowadays wild boar is present basically everywhere in Europe. This species is extremely plastic and adaptable. You can find on the sea looking for seagulls' nests like here, and on the top of a mountain rooting in spring. And the outcome is that in Europe we have wild boar of very different size. And you may see that, the car can be the measurements that can be used as a comparison between Russia and Sardinia. That is the island where I teach. Wild boar is increasing in all our continents. Some countries experience an extinction due to overhunting or to climate change. Not in the present way, but in the sense of worse climate with more cold during the 19th century. But now, as I told you, we are experiencing an increase that can be seen quite clearly if we analyze the hunting bag of, say, 5 different countries selected in 5 different places in Europe, that are France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Sweden. And you may notice that if we consider the present hunting bag, the top, in 30 years ago, we had more or less 10 to 20% of the present hunting bag. That explains to you how enormous the increase of this species in Europe was. This lead to some extreme cases, like I've heard for your country. That is the case of urban wild boar, for instance, in Berlin. Berlin is a big city, is the head city in Germany, is basically built up from many different towns that came together, and has a lot of green areas inside, a lot of parks. And this implies also that it is a very good area for wildlife, and at present in Berlin you can find up to 10,000 wild boar. But this is not the case of Northern Europe only. Also in Southern Europe we have a lot of wild boar in cities, like this wild boar using a swimming pool in Barcelona, not for the happiness of the owners of the swimming pool. And this is now a very widespread problem. So wild boar is really so adaptable that it has found a permanent place in our cities. What are the reasons of this increase? I will use my country, that is Italy, just to explain you what are the reasons of the increase all Europe experienced after the last World War. As you may notice from these images, we have always no wild boar in Italy at the beginning of the last century. And the situation was not so different 50 years after, with a small difference in the Northern Alps. And here there is an interesting example that we may discuss during next time, that explain the relationship between human people and humans and wild boar in this continent. In any case, now the situation is completely changed. Wild boar is present overall Italy, and they are of different origin. Mainly, the two main origins are the increase of the remnant stocks and the restocking done by hunters. But the reason why this changed so quickly are different, but the most important one is in the deep change in the work and social organization of my country. My country at the beginning of the last century was mainly an agricultural country with a lot of people living in the countryside and very few people living in cities. Then we started a change that was very important in the last 50 years that brought people outside from mountain and hilly environment to concentrate in cities. What you see on the map are all the municipalities that lost people from 1871 to 1951. This is the start of the process of losing people that was true till this date. That is the time in which these data were collected. If you know a little bit the geography of my country, you see the Alps and the Apennines and the mountain reliefs in Sardinia. So basically, everywhere there were difficult conditions for human beings. The countryside was left, and all the people went to produce this car in cities. And the important thing is that this process was more pronounced in places where working opportunities were better. So we had a more fast leftover of countryside in northern Italy than in southern Italy. In fact, these are the percentages of depopulation of mountain area. This is north, central, and south Italy. And this sort of car were produced in northern Italy. This led also to a change in other activities, in the sense that, for instance, sheep and goat breeding decreased. But on the same time, forest cover increased. This is the same place after 50 years. And you can hardly recognize the area. Sorry. Another important point was the increase of protected areas. We had only 4 national parks till 1992. Now we have 21 national parks. That means we increased tremendously the protected area in our country. And we restocked wild ungulate. Not only wild boar, but also roe deer, like in this case. These processes are common to most Europe. They may have taken place in different times, but more or less they synthesize what happened in our continent. There is one more factor that is important in countries different from ours, that is the deep change in the kind of agriculture that is synthesized by this graph here. This is maize cultivation in Germany, and you see that they increase their cultivation of many fold to a very high production standard. And maize, by the way, is one of the favorite agricultural crops of wild boar. There are also some natural factors that may influence the distribution and number of wild boar. One of the most important is mastery species distribution. Here you have the distribution of the most important mastery species in our continent, that are oaks and chestnut. If you put the distribution of wild boar on this distribution, you find a very important matching, at least for Western Europe. forest productivity is very important, and I will give you an example from one of our study areas on wild boar to convince you about that. I will present to you some data on two study areas that we have in Tuscany, in central Italy. The first is on the Apennine, the second is on the coast. Now I will refer to the first one, and the name is Alpe di Catenaia, that means Catenaia Mountain. In this area, we keep on collecting data on the production of beech, chestnut, and turkey oak from 1991 till now. You see the usual pattern with peaks of production and a very low productive year. One point that is important is that when you have more than one species together, you have to sum up the different production. And this is important both for years in which you have peak, but also in years when one species has a very limited production, but the other one has a very high production. In an environment where you have more than one must-tree species, one can buffer the production of the other, and this can guarantee a standing crop for wild boar. That means a very easy live condition. And if you match the hunting bag with seed production in the same area, you have a very clear matching. That is very clear for all the production summed together, but is also very clear for the relation with the two most important species, that is chestnut and turkey oak in this case. It is interesting to note that there are areas in Europe where you have not mass species, for instance, in Mediterranean, that are very poor grounds where you have only shrubs. Also in this case, wild boar population dynamics can be conditioned by the production of plants like this one. This is Pistachia lentiscus, is a sort of shrubs living in the Mediterranean, and the berry of these shrubs are produced in autumn, like oaks, and are also driving, in this case, the population dynamics of wild boar. Another important element is climate. January temperature can be extremely important in determining the distribution of wild boar because wild boar have very difficult time to move in the snow, as you know, and to root in iced ground. And there is a good example of long-term data collected on this point by some Polish colleagues in the forest of Białowieża, where they have data from 1780 till now, and when they have also data on wild ungulates abundance. In this context, they show quite clearly that in general, ungulates density were positively correlated with temperature, but the most influenced species among ungulate was exactly wild boar, whose density correlated quite clearly with mean annual temperature. This was also confirmed by a broad study done on all Europe and European Russia by Melis et al. And they took into account many different environmental factors like vegetation productivity, January temperature, presence of predators, and the outcome was that the main factors determining wild boar density was the mean temperature of January. If you think that in a more wide time scale, and if you look at the future, and if you take into account that we are experiencing an increasing trend in the temperature, you may figure out quite clearly that wild boar is one of the European species that is presumed to expand their distribution north at expensive to species that are linked to alpine or very cold environment that will experience a very bad time, and this is already true for ibex on the Alp. What about the estimate of numbers and density? Wild boar is very numerous in Europe. We have almost 4 million wild boar living in Europe with different densities that you see on this map. And with this number, wild boar is the second most important European ungulates in terms of number. The first is roe deer, and the third is red deer. If you think in terms of biomass, wild boar is again the second most important ungulates in Europe after the red deer. In our continent, the genetic situation of wild boar is easily explained by the glaciation, especially by the last glaciation. What happened during the last glaciation was that basically all continental Europe was covered by a very strong, not covered, was interested by a very strong climate that implied that the ground was permanently frozen. Then there was a big ice sheet northern from this. This was true also for the Alps, and just the three most important peninsulas, the Iberic one, the Italian one, and the Balkanic one, were free of this limit. What happened was that you found wild boar south of this line, but not north of this line. When this limit was relaxed, wild boar were able to move north, but this had some consequences. The most important is that the wild boars living in the Italian peninsula, the one that had the most effective barrier, were isolated and developed a specific private clade of mitochondrial DNA. On the contrary, the other two refugia were readily connected each other north from the Alps. So basically, the outcome is that now in Europe we have one general clade of mitochondrial DNA of all Europe, instead the one that is typical from Italian peninsula, and then we have two other different clades, north and east, and the Asian one. If we look at the present situation that we analyze with other colleagues, the outcome is that you find a, generally speaking, so to say, homogeneous situation all throughout Europe. In the Italian area, you found an intermix of the European general haplotype group and the private Italian haplotype group. And here and there, you see also some Asiatic haplotypes. And these Asiatic haplotypes, the yellow one, are just the outcome of the fact that our domestic pigs came out of a crossbred between Asian pigs and local breeds that implied that more or less 1/4 of their genome come from Asia. And this, with crossbred, intentional or accidental, came into the genome of the wild boar, European wild boar, representing a very tiny part, but it was still possible to be recognized. Okay, we can skip this, and then we can move to the management part, starting from hunting. Hunting wild boar was a very common and very serious affair in Europe till very old time. Generally speaking, wild boar hunting had two meanings. The first was common to other animals like bird, that was a sort of show up of strength and courage, and it was intended like a sort of preparation for war. But the second is more interesting because it is often reported by myths of Greek and Roman culture, that is a sort of fight between civilization and the wild world that is outside the agricultural areas. Very often, both in Greek and in Roman culture, appear the image of a big, enormous, ferocious wild boar that is destroying crops and is killing people, and then come out a hero that show up that he is a hero killing this wild boar. And this is interesting because it's suggestive to the fact that also at that time, look at this, that come from North Africa at the time when Romans colonized it. Also at that time, wild boar was clearly perceived like an enemy of crops and agriculture. And this stayed till present times in our culture, and this is the main reason why in many European countries wild boar was almost exterminated. What are the hunting techniques that are used in Europe with wild boar? The dominating one is drives, the battue, with or without dogs, more often with dogs. Then you have the sit and wait, and then sit and wait with bait. They put some food and then they wait wild boar and they shoot it. In Spain, they make big drives with hundreds of dogs where they shoot all animals that come out, like you see here, and the name of this practice is Monteria. In Italy, there are drive with hounds with a group of hunters that are a unit, a fixed unit that hunt only wild boar that have specifically trained dogs for this species. In the German system, night hunting with bait is the most common way of killing wild boar. How many wild boar are killed in our continent? Around 1.7 million each year. And there are 6 countries in this system that have hunting bags over 100,000 boars. That is Germany, France, that are culling each year more or less 500,000 wild boar. And then there is Spain, Poland, Czech Republic, and Italy. The kill density can be substantial, in particular in places like Germany and France, when as you have seen. One interesting point that is underlining what my English colleague has told to you is that we have a very variable way to manage wild boar, also in terms of hunting season. You see there are an incredible variety of approaches that can be summarized more or less in 3. The first is the one of countries that hunt wild boar all year long. The other is that of countries that hunt just 8 months, excluding the month in which wild boar gives birth. So spring is more or less excluded. And the third one is that typical of Mediterranean countries, Spain, Italy, Greece, where just 3 months of hunting are allowed. The bad news is that the success in controlling wild boar is absolutely not related to this approach. Every country has problems in spite of the fact that they are hunting all year long in 3 months or in 8 months. And one of these problems can be linked by a fact that was told many times also from the colleagues from your country. That is, also in Europe, hunters are decreasing. This is the example of Luxembourg. When you see that hunting permits are decreasing, that means wild boar hunters are decreasing, even if wild boar are clearly increasing. This is another example from the region where I live, in Tuscany, in Italy, where we lost a number of hunters in very few years, and when the mean age of hunters is between 53 and 56 years. Intense wild boar hunting can have very deep effect on the spatial behavior of wild boar and on other species. I will show you some examples just to point out that hunting per se can be a problem. So we have not only the problem to control wild boar, but also the problem to do something wrong for the species or for other species. There are many cases of the effect of drives with dog that explain, like in this case, that during a drive, the effect is to spread wild boar all over the area where you are hunting, and this effect is permanent just after the hunting. What is the outcome? The outcome is that you force animals to stay in places where you do not like to have wild boar, and you increase your damage probability. The same is shown here. Here is illustrated the distances between resting site and capture site. Here in the pre-hunting is very limited, but during the hunting is extremely wide. Note this bar about 10-kilometer distance. That means, again, you have more wild boar around. And the third one is the reserve effect. If you have a preserved area, that is in black here, and if you hunt, you have more wild boar inside the protected area than if you do not hunt. That means you have a concentration on wild boar within the protected area. But this happens not only for wild boar, but for a lot of other species. We have an example about roe deer, again from the Alpe di Catenaia study area. This is that is interesting because it is constituted by a big mountain. The top of this mountain is protected, is in green, and all the colored areas are hunting areas for wild boar teams. Hunting is substantial in this area because on 12,000 hectares, they are killing on average 600 wild boar per year, and they hunt 3 times per week. In general, our hunting group is constituted of 27 hunters and 19 dogs. We looked at the behavior of 62 roe deer, dividing the time in 3. No hunting time, that is green, stalking, that is red, and then hunting with dogs, that is blue. And the outcome was, modeling this and looking at the probability of a roe deer being outside the protected area, that hunting techniques were important in determining this probability. And basically, no hunting and roe deer stalking were equivalent, but driving with dogs were the main reason why a roe deer went out. Went in, the protected area. Is this a problem? It is a problem because within the protected area, it is on the top of the mountain, there is the poorest vegetation. This is all beech forest. And moreover, there are the highest altitude and less productive environment that in our case is the deciduous coppice forest and meadows and pastures that are more abundant outside than inside. So they went in a less productive area, and they went in a less productive area in a time of the year in which you are presumed to have ungulates down in the valley, not on the top of the mountain, that is winter. And this happens systematically. This is the only example I brought to you, but there are a lot of them, in all protected areas of my country. That implies you have a lot of animals concentrated in protected areas, doing a lot of damages, and living very badly, if we think at welfare of animal, because wild boar are hunted in a not proper way. But this can be also transferred to social units. When you think at wild boar, you think at an animal that have a very clear social unit with group of females that are related, that are accompanied by their piglets. When these piglets leave the mothers, they make up band of brothers that are moving. So what you expect is to have to deal with highly related group of animals. What we did in this area was to look at genetic relatedness using as a standard the relation between females and piglets, and using females that were shot during huntings and their fetuses. So this was the standard, more or less 50% relatedness. Then we looked at the group we had, and we discovered, for instance, that the females within a group were very limitedly related each other. And if we looked at the group of yearling, the band of brothers I have mentioned to you, they were in fact no brothers at all. Why is that? This is because the survival that we estimated using more or less 200 radiocollar wild boar in this population due to hunting was extremely limited. The probability to survive after 1 year was extremely low for yearling, intermediate for piglet, and a little bit higher for adult. So basically, the group we were seeing were not group of related animals, but group of survivors. And again, this is a disruption of a social unit that may have implication for the capacity of this animal to produce damages. The reason why these animals stayed together is easy to be found. In this area, we have a pack of wolves that is mainly preying on wild boar. So it's important for them to make a group in any case, even if they were not related. And if you think that in a medium-sized Tuscan province, there are about 100 hunting teams, so there are more than 5,000 hunters, and they hunt 3 times a week over at least 3 months. You can imagine which kind of pressure is exerted, not only on wild boar, but on all terrestrial wildlife. Another point that was important in our view of the problem was the impact of wolf predation and hunting on wild boar. This was important because in my country and in other European countries, wolves and in general large predators are blamed for the take that they make on ungulates. And ungulates hunters are extremely angry with large carnivores because they say, okay, they are terrible competitors, they will completely destroy our prey, and so it was important to measure this point. It was pretty clear from the work that I have already mentioned to you of Melis et al. That wolf predation was not on a European scale so important for wild boar as it was for other species. But on the same time, it was obviously clear then wild boar was important for wolf. In fact, in Western Europe, we had quite a few population of wolves that are recovering quite quickly, and at least 2 of them, the Spanish one and the Italian one, rely mainly on wild boar as main prey species. So we wanted to see things in detail, looking at this relation that you see on the screen. Again, in the Alpe di Catenaia, and you know already the structure of this area. And we measure here the presence of wolves and the presence and density of hunters, wild boar, and roe deer. From a preliminary analysis, it was pretty obvious that wild boar was the main prey species in wolf diet, and that he was selected for. This trend was consistent among years, so wild boar was almost every year the most important prey species, and his selection was quite clear and quite high. It was so clear that we saw a functional dietary response of wolf towards wild boar abundance. That is, the more wild boar we had, the more wild boar we found in wolf scats. So it was again obvious that also here that wild boar was important for wolves. Wolves relied mainly on wild boar, and his diet was dependent on the availability of wild boar. Then we wanted to make a step further, so to see how many wild boar were killed by wolves and how many wild boar were killed by hunters. Not only how many, but which. So we calculated the takeoff of wild boar, knowing the pack size of wolves, the wolf diet, and using an equation to calculate the food necessity of each wolf. And we calculate the wolf impact. And this is the outcome. If we look at wolf impact, we had a pack that was removing more or less 73 individuals per year from wild boar population. That means 5.7% of individuals. Okay, take into account that more or less the increase of a wild boar population can range, in our situation, can range from 30 from 120%. Moreover, the categories that were most sprayed were those of wild boar below 1 year of age, that is less than 10 kilograms and between 10 and 35 kilograms. Very limited share was on the adult category. If we look at hunters, hunters were using more or less 600 wild boar per year. That means 53.4% of individual. That is tenfold the takeoff of wolves. Moreover, hunters were mainly killing adult wild boar. So they were doing completely different things. Seeing another way and comparing this with the structure of population, wolves were significantly preying more on young boars. Hunters were significantly preying more on adult wild boar. So they had different take and they have also different selection in age classes. This was confirmed also looking at our long-term wild boar monitoring. We have VHF collars on more or less 200 wild boar, and this is the mortality. These are the mortality causes, and legal hunting was 46, and wolf was just 3. So again, more than 1 to 10. But the other outcome was that if we put together hunter's cull and wolf predation, and we look at the density of the next year, we saw clearly that neither hunter's cull nor predation and neither both together had any influence on the wild boar density of the subsequent year. And this influence, I've already shown you these results, was pretty clear when you took into account the production of mast trees. So the take-home message here is that hunting per se, even if exerted with very strong pressure, difficultly have a real impact, at least in our situation. Another difficult point, counts. There are a lot of ways to counting wild boar in Europe, from snow tracking through direct observation at feeding station, direct observation including drives, the use of hunting bag, no census at all. It is interesting to notice that no census at all is used in France and Germany. So the two nations that have so many wild boar that they do not care about how many they kill, because they can kill what they want, but they are not able to make any trouble or to exert any danger to the survival of this species. The problem with counts is that they are obviously inefficient in our continent. There are some historical examples like this one, and I mentioned Hungary, but I could have used also Poland or a lot of other countries, where the number counted sometimes is below of the official harvest, meaning that they must have done some mistake. But they are not the only one. We also in Italy are doing a lot of mistakes, including my group. And I will show you some data from the other area that is on the coast near the city of Pisa. This is a big fenced estate. It's more or less 5,000 hectares. It was the hunting ground of our President of the Republic, so it was very well managed. In this area, it sees they used to count wild boar on feeding station. And the good point is that the cull is done only by gamekeeper, and having this and having a fence or the sea, we are able to understand the mistake we do year after year, because say if we count 100 adult boar and the next year there are again 100 adult boar, even if we have culled 100 adult boar, we know that we have not counted at least 100 adult boar. So we did a minimum mistake of 100%. So now you can understand this graph. That is the number we counted in red, and in blue, the number of animals that we left. And you can notice that in some years, we did a mistake that is more than 100%, well beyond 100%, well above. And this happened in an area that is fenced, where we use the same feeding place, the same people, year after year. This is a time series from '93, but I mean, for sake of brevity, I have not brought with me the other 10 years, but the outcome is more or less the same. Another example that I can give to you is related to the first study area, where we use drive counts. We have calculated the confidence interval of our drive counts, and you can see that in some cases, the confidence interval are so wide that you had better not counted a wild boar in this case. And this was the reason why in the selectivity graph, there were so big bars of errors. So the final message is very, very difficult in our continent to have good data on wild boar density. What we can have and we can offer is a minimum number, not a clear indication of a density. What we can use is the cull rate, provided that cull intensity is equal. And this is something that we are increasingly using also in the management. Then the darkest point, damages. In Europe, we are paying more than 80 million euros per year, per day. And the most damaged country is Germany, that pays more than 40 million euro per year. But there are other countries paying quite a few compensation for these damages to agriculture. Damages to what? Basically, damages to everything. There is this very interesting review paper that explained that more or less wild boar is so adaptable that can eat almost anything that is planted by man, but crop is one of the most common subject all around Europe. There are a lot of interesting examples. One of these is this from Switzerland, where you have a very clear coincidence between the amount of maize that was planted and the amount of wild boar that were killed, explained what was the main source of food of Swiss wild boar. There are some countries, especially in the south, for instance, my country and France, where wild boar is the main damaging species. Wild boar can be responsible up to 90% of total damage inflicted by wildlife. And you see here, from 1992 on, the bar of damages is broken in different species. This is wild boar, this is red deer, this is roe deer. You see that wild boar is almost every time beyond 15 million euro per day, and is clearly the most important damaged species in this country. This is true also in Tuscany, where wild boar is up to 60% of all damages. And it's interesting to note, again speaking about large predators, that in places in which, like this province, the province of Arezzo, that is the province where Alpe di Catenaia is, where I live, and where is one of the highest wolf density of Europe, I would say, the compensation paid for wolves are incredibly low if you compare that with the compensation paid for wild boar in 1 year in this time interval. So wild boar is has a real impact on economic activities. And in some cases, wild boar can be a problem also for livestock. There are cases in which wild boar can prey actively on lamb. And this is, for instance, the case of Sardinia, where no large predators are present, and where wild boar can have an impact. What can be done to prevent damages in Europe, or what is done? Amount of things, and the only one I can say is really effective is this one. Fencing with very robust net down in the ground at least 50 centimeters or more. This is the only way that avoid at all damages. And I can say that also because my family has a vineyard and we have tried many solutions. This was the only one. Sometimes there are cases in which other means can be useful. For instance, in this case, use maize foraging can reduce the level of damages to vineyard. In other cases, it's said that hunting can be effective in reducing crop damages, but there are also examples of different signs. I have already shown you one on a limited scale, that is our study area. This one refers to a region that is 2.5 million hectares wide, that is Tuscany. And in Tuscany, if you put the harvest of wild boar against the damage inflicted the next year, you find no relation at all. That means, again, that hunting in this way has no effect on the amount of damage you can suffer. A further way to reduce locally wild boar damages is trapping. In Southern Europe, my country, France, Spain, there is quite a strong experience in wild boar trapping, and you can trap an awful amount of wild boar in a very limited time, biting them with mace or with chestnut, and using this sort of trap you see here. For instance, in the small area I have told you, that is San Rossore State, 5,000 hectares, we remove up to 500 wild boar per year just using trapping. And other way is netting, that is used in very particular case and can be effective. About foraging, all European countries do feed wild boar. There are extreme cases. In Germany, for each wild boar killed, more than 100 kilograms of artificial feeding are given. And this is the main point. If you feed wild boar, irrespectively from the fact that you are doing that for to avoid this animal eating your crops, for hunting, for census, more or less you had a population increase. That is the direct aim in 45% of cases, but it stays like a result in 100%. So artificial feeding has a lot of very bad effect because it alters spatial behavior. I have not brought you the data, but it's obvious that when you feed animals, you have concentrating wild boar in a small spot. You habituate wild boar to humans. This wild boar was waiting for feeding, and you obviously increase wild boar numbers because you fed wild boar in order to increase their numbers. So you really do exactly the opposite of what you had to do. With traffic, wild boar has not a special relationship, but traffic incidents with ungulates are very costly in general in Europe, both in terms of money, in terms of human life. And wild boar can be implied in traffic accident. He has a sort of intermediate tendency among European ungulates. This is the case of Sweden, this is the case of Germany. So you see that it is not so implied like roe deer, but it is more or less in the average of wild boar. That means that where you have a lot of wild boar, you have a lot of accident caused by wild boar. And finally, diseases. We had a lot of problem with diseases in Europe. This one, swine fever, may imply you have to stamp out completely a domestic pig breeding farm. And this can cause a lot of damages in terms of economics, and also imply for our European legislation that the area where you have swine fever cannot export pig meat. That means that the breeders are really ruined by that. And other diseases can be important for people, trichinosis, for example, and can have an heavy impact on our health. That said, thank you very much for listening.
アポロニオ先生、ありがとうございました。では発表内容に関して、質疑応答がある方は、挙手をお願いします。
総括的な話を大変ありがとうございました。一つ細かい点聞きたいんですけれども、ダメージのコンペンセーションがありましたね。被害補償ですね。被害補償、ダメージコンペンセーション。で、このお金はの元は何ですか、原資は何ですか、タックスなのか、ライセンスフィーなのか、それからその他の、例えば保険とか、そういうことでいうとどれでしょうか。
Yeah, thank you. It's very different from country to country. Generally speaking, where the wild boar and ungulates and wildlife is not property of the owner of the farm, so to say, or to the land, this is paid, compensations are paid using the money coming from hunter's license. Hunter's license fee as a part that is devoted to compensation. In other part of the continent, where the owner of the land is also the owner either of the animal or of the right to hunt, this is an internal problem between the owner and the hunters that are using his land. And so these are the two main sources. There are also a third case, that is the case in which you have national parks. That is a big problem in Europe and also in Italy, because in this case the responsible is the national park, that means the federal government. And so the nation has to pay the people that suffer damages within national park boundaries.
他にございますでしょうか。
興味深いお話ありがとうございました。日本の私たちのいる地域でもイノシシが都市に侵入をして、非常にコンフリクト、人との圧力を及ぼしておりますけれども、先ほどベルリンで、相当数が都市に生息しているというお話が、あったかと思うんですが、そのコンフリクトですね、人とのコンフリクトが、発生しているのかどうなのかということと、その要因ですね、要因が何か、日本では餌付けの問題というのが発生していますけれども、都市に侵入する要因があれば教えていただきたいんですが。
Thank you. In the case of Berlin, I do not know, frankly, if they have open conflict with people, but I can report cases from my country that I know better. And in this case, yes, there are conflicts, especially linked to the fact that wild boar are entering private gardens, destroying them, and they are also coming very close to people, frightening children and in general, people not accustomed to the presence of wild boar. And this happened because very often in this area, the garbage is not protected and is just left out of the house in plastic containers that are not wild boar proof. That means wild boar come, they put on the ground these things, and then they eat garbage. And they become accustomed, they are fed, as in your case, and they realize that to come close to humans is profitable because they have a lot of food for nothing. And this is a big problem also because sometimes you have, I am speaking about Italy, you have cases in which wild boar can cause wounds to people because they come too close to be fed. And this is an obvious problem. And in some areas we have recommended to do something like in the case of bears, that is either to use iron containers to avoid wild boar to have access to food or not to leave garbage at all outside house.